this, I felt the internet should be a place where people can have freedom to communicate, really, and I realized that actually it would be quite easy to censor the internet if people wanted to. So I set about designing an architecture, a piece of software that would prevent that. And the basic, well, without going into too much detail, but the basic principle behind Freenet is similar to that of an ant colony, where you have a large number of individually simple things, ants, or in Freenet's case, computers running the Freenet software, and they all join together to form this global network which allows people to exchange information. In terms of the controversy that Freenet has generated, there's probably been two types of controversy. The first is over the issue of copyright, because any system which allows people to communicate freely and anonymously inherently makes it impossible to enforce copyright law. Now, it's nothing new that communication technologies make it harder to enforce copyright law. If you witness the battles over Napster and everything that's been going on since, but in those cases you can actually figure out who's doing what and ultimately shut them down. But with a system like Freenet, that is impossible. And so I found myself getting sucked into this debate over, how do you enforce copyright on the internet? If you can't, what do you do instead? And that kind of is what led on to one of my other projects, Rever. The other kind of side of the debate over Freenet is kind of the more general debate over freedom of information. Should people have true freedom to communicate? And most people instinctively say, yeah, well, freedom of speech, but what about child pornography, for example? There's no way for something like Freenet to distinguish between an innocent photograph and a piece of illegal child pornography. And so it kind of raises this moral dilemma that, if you really want freedom of information, you've got to accept, things that a lot of people don't like a lot. So I'd say those are the two main controversies that Freenet generates.
So you say the only way to have absolute free speech is to have absolute anonymity, right?
Yes.
So is that why you don't have a Twitter account?
Actually, I do. It's just cleverly disguised.
It's anonymous.
No, it's just cleverly disguised by not being very interesting, so no one can find it.
So another bit is, you say that it's a common misconception that anonymous information should not be trusted. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of contradicts one of, Jessica and my thinking, and what we sort of are researching is that actually the only way to do it is the exact opposite, is to have that there is no anonymity. Mm-hmm. So I guess what would be your retort, or how would you talk us out of our silly ideas?
Mm-hmm. Well, did you read the New York Times? Do you find it relatively trustworthy? Yeah. Do you know the social security number of the editor of the New York Times?
No.
Do you know his name?
Could find it.
Huh?
Yeah.
Could find it.
You could, but you trust it without actually having that information. And I think it's certainly the case that, if somebody anonymously said, by the way, the world is run by lizards and, Prince Charles is the king lizard, then you're probably not going to put a lot of faith in that. But if you had an anonymous source for information, which maybe you'd grown to trust over the years, you might actually have more faith in that anonymous source. So, for example, the authors of the Federalist Papers, we now know who they are, but at the time they signed those papers anonymously. because they were afraid of the government. So I think your instinct is right, which is that if somebody just says something and they're anonymous, you're not going to trust them immediately. But I think it is possible to learn to trust anonymous sources, just in the same way that it's possible to learn to trust sources that are not anonymous. You look at their track record.
Okay, so you mentioned that Freenet would be useful in China and Saudi Arabia and countries where censorship is a big problem. How does that fit into the U.S. and does it have a popular user base in the U.S.?
Well, fortunately for us living in the U.S., the U.S. government is a lot better about censorship than the Chinese government. But it does still exist. And interestingly, in the U.S., often the form the censorship takes is not the government knocking down your door and arresting you, but often it's things like copyright law and trade secret law that are used to suppress information. So the classic example of this would be the company Diebold, who make voting machines. Somebody leaked the source code to their voting machines, and a professor, temporarily forgetting his name, but he studied this source code and discovered that it was full of problems. And what was Diebold's response? Did they try to fix it? No. They said, you're infringing our trade secret and we are going to sue you. So there are still valid reasons why you might want to use something like Freenet in the US, and in fact that source code was placed on Freenet shortly after it was leaked.
Okay, so I think that's a good transition into fair share. So I think we're both interested in the concept. You had a question about fair share.
Oh, well, I actually wanted to talk about the iPhone really quick. Okay, so I just read this article the other day about how the iPhone with the Digital Copyright Millennium Act, how now jailbreaking your iPhone is a felony. So how do you feel about that, and how can do you have an iPhone, and how does the user community combat that?
I do have an iPhone, but I've hacked it.
Right.
I think that this is a major concern. I like Apple, I like the products that they make, but they have done more to introduce digital rights management, this concept that they own the devices that you actually have paid for and use on a daily basis. Apple has done more, taken that concept a lot further than anyone else has. Like people complain about Microsoft all the time, like Microsoft did this, Microsoft did that. Imagine if Microsoft said, if you want to write a piece of Windows software, you need our permission, and we will shut you down and remove your software if we don't like it or if it competes with us. Microsoft would never do that. They never get away with it. That's what Apple does every day with the iPhone.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian Clarke, South by Southwest.